Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab. We are back with a system build here today, and we're going to be using a lot of the hardware that we all want right now, such as the MSI RTX 5070 Gaming Trio OC, so the pre-overclock version of this triple fan monster graphics card. Other hardware we've got here, we've got the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Black, because we're not going to be using a crazy hot running processor. This processor cooler will be absolutely fine, and it's very affordable as well. Just costs $30 or £30 here in the UK. Other stuff, we've got a 32GB kit of Kingston Renegade DDR5 6400 memory, so plenty of capacity here as well as RGB lighting. We've got a 1TB Samsung 990 Pro for plenty of capacity when it comes to storing our games. And in terms of power supplies, we're going to be using an 850 watt model from InWin, partly because it has a native 16-pin connector for our NVIDIA graphics card. Now, when it comes to the processor and motherboard, originally, I wanted to go for the MAG B860 Tomahawk Wi-Fi. In fact, that is the motherboard that we're going to be going for because I really wanted to take a look at what the new Tomahawk motherboards offer in terms of Intel, because Tomahawk has been a great brand, and we're going to be looking at a roundup of all of the current Tomahawks in a future video as well to see what they offer. And this motherboard obviously doesn't support overclocking because it's the B860 chipset from Intel. You'll need Z890 or Z890 here across the pond for overclocking. But the problem I had is with the processor, because the Core Ultra 5 245K is pretty much the same price as the 235, the non-overclocking version pretty much of that processor here in the UK. So if they cost pretty much the same, then shouldn't you just go for the Core Ultra 5 245K because it has a 200 megahertz higher boost frequency? So kind of an interesting discussion that we need to have there about that processor. In the US, there's a bit more of a gap, but I'd still say that the 245K is worth considering, even if you're going for a B series chipset. Now, obviously, there's overclocking available as well on the 245K, which you may or may not want. If you don't want it now, you might want it in future. So even if you just want to get a slightly faster processor, there's still the benefit of potentially having an overclockable processor if you decide to swap this motherboard out for a Z890 motherboard in future. So interesting discussion there over the processor, but I'm going to be going with the 245K today. I did decide to run with that one because thanks to the higher clock speed and the fact it costs pretty much the same here in the UK. There's like about 10 or 20 pounds in it, which is nothing. So we're going to be just looking at the pricing and stuff in just a moment. And the case that we're going to be using is the MSI Gungnir 300R Airflow, and that is one of my favorite cases out there right now. It's very affordable, costs just over £100 here in the UK and about $130 in the US. And you can get a white version as well, which I think is strangely a little bit cheaper than the black version. Fully kitted out with 4 RGB fans. It looks fantastic. And if you wanted to upgrade your cooling or anything else in future, it's got plenty of room for expansion as well. So you can find links to all of the hardware in today's video down in the description down below. And I just make a bit of a cutback from all of those links. Just helps me run the channel here and keeps food on the table, that kind of thing. And if you do like today's video, don't forget to chuck me a like and a comment down below. Just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. And also thanks to MSI for sponsoring today's video as well and sending over these 2 awesome bits of hardware. So what are we looking at in terms of pricing? Well, we've got about £1,800 worth of hardware in today's video, but you could potentially save a little bit more by opting for the 16GB kit of this memory and maybe even dropping down a notch on the processor or going for a slightly more affordable graphics card as well. And in the US, we've got about $2,200, $2,300 or thereabouts for all of the hardware as well. So that's it for the intro. I'd like to thank MSI for sponsoring today's video again, and we're going to be doing a quick unboxing of some of the core hardware here today, and then we're going to be running on to the system build, doing some benchmarks and coming to some conclusions at the end. So that's it. Let's crack on with the unboxings. All right then, so we're going to go through a quick run through of all the hardware that we've got for this build, just in a little bit more detail. So first up, we've got the SSD. So the 990 Pro from Samsung is pretty much one of the go-to SSDs out there now. It's pretty good value. PCI Express 5 obviously is an option. The 9100 Pro from Samsung is its new PCI Express 5 SSD, and it does run a lot cooler than other PCI Express 5 SSDs I've tested. You can see my review to that SSD in the description down below, as well as a link where to buy it if you want to have those crazy speeds. But ultimately, this is much better value. There are limited gains from opting for PCI Express 5, even though the motherboard, the MAG B860 Tomahawk Wi-Fi does support a PCI Express 5 SSD, it's, in my view, is not really worth it. If you're going all out and you have a budget of probably double what we have here, then you might want to consider it. Or if you're going to be really making use of those extra sequential speeds, because we can see here, read speed of about 7,400 megabytes a second, you'll be getting nearly double that with the 9100 Pro. But outside of those sequential speeds, there are limited gains, so just bear that in mind. So we're just going to get this out of its box and ready for the installation. So we've gone for the heatsink-less version because our motherboard comes with a heatsink on the PCI Express slot, so we don't really need a heatsink with the SSD, so we can potentially save some money here. I would always recommend getting the most capacity that you can afford. So if you can afford to go for 2 terabytes, then absolutely do. Just bear in mind that this 1 terabyte gets eaten up very, very quickly, with Windows often taking up 10 or 20% of that before you've even started. So once you've installed all your programs and your games, I mean, games are absolutely enormous these days, so always consider getting more storage than you actually need. But we're just going to put that to one side for now. So the memory, you have a few options with Intel. So you can go for a standard sort of 6,000, 6,400 megahertz or mega transfer, should I say, a second kit like this. We've gone 32 gigabytes, which I would also recommend you get now for a system that you want to hold on to for a few years. I'm finding that 16 gigabytes is just not enough in a whole bunch of situations now. And the speed is the other issue. So 6400 DDR5 is pretty good, but the motherboards for Intel's LGA 1851 platform do support a slightly different version of this called QDIM memory. So it's just a slightly better implementation of DDR5. It's compatible with all DDR5 sockets, but Intel specifically supports it, and they do 48 gigabyte 8200 DDR5 kits on that one. So if you want to go for a QDIM kit, you can see the description in down below, and you can find a link to a QDIM kit that I recommend if you want to get the absolute most out of your Intel system. Otherwise, just stick with standard DDR5 like we've got here with the Kingston Renegade, and we've got some snazzy RGB lighting as well. Now for the cooler, I mentioned earlier, we've got the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Black. It's one of my favorite air coolers for the simple reason it's very easy to install and does a decent job of cooling even high-end processors. And I tested this with a whole bunch of processors recently, including the Ryzen 7 9800X3D over on an AMD platform, and it coped with that pretty much fine. We're going to be using the Core Ultra 5 processor here today, so this has plenty of cooling for that CPU. And for the Intel platform, what you do is just apply the backplate to the back of the motherboard, apply the Intel mounting clips here, and then those just pass through the motherboard and secure to the backplate. Super, super easy. The only other thing you need to do is to secure the fan to the heatsink and have it exhausting out the back of your PC. So if your case is kind of sitting here like that, the front is there and the rear is there, you probably want to have it that way around on your motherboard. So that is pretty much all we need to say about the cooler. Again, around 30 bucks, 30 pounds here in the UK. Very, very good value. Now let's unbox our graphics card and have a look. Oh, I should mention that the cooler comes with its own thermal paste as well, so you get a couple of applications, which is much more handy than having the thermal paste pre-applied, as easy as that is. So let's have a look at the gaming trio. Now I've already looked at this in my 5070 review, so it's not an entirely new box, but we put it back as best we could for the video today. So here we are with the MSI RTX 5070 Gaming Trio OC. So pre-overclock, so we've got slightly higher frequencies than standard, so you will see a little bit more performance. And yeah, looking like a really sweet card. It is pretty large though, so you'll have to bear that in mind. It's not for mini ICX cases and all that kind of stuff, but most ACX cases should be absolutely fine. And I believe I can actually fit this in my my Height Revolt 3 mini ICX case. It actually goes vertically in that case, so has just about enough room for that. But 3 fans, very, very large heatsink, and you can see the PCB kind of ends there. So you've got all this extra cooling going on with this card. So hopefully it will be a lot cooler than some of the smaller models out there. And our power supply obviously has the 450 watt 16 pin connector, so we can just plug that straight into there like that, and away we go. Now the power supply I've gone for is the InWin V85 850 watt model. I will recommend a couple of other power supplies that you can go for in the description below, because I know that this one probably isn't available in the UK right now, but there are some other very, very similar ones that I can recommend. In the US, this thing costs just over $100, so pretty good value for a 850 watt model that supports a 16 pin, native 16 pin output, which is down here, so you don't need to worry about any connecting any other cables or anything like that. It's just got a straight 16 pin connector down there for NVIDIA GPUs, and it's gold rated as well, so it should be pretty quiet. So that is pretty much it for most of the hardware. I'm going to grab the case and get rid of all this stuff here, and we'll have a closer look at the case. So here we are with the case that we are going to be using, and as you can see, we've actually already got a PC in here right now. So this is leftover from a video I posted the other day where I was testing the cooler in here, which is the MSI MAG Core Liquid A15 360. So it's a large 360mm radiator, and some of the best things about it is it's got daisy chain fans with the cables all hidden, and you just have a single output for fan speed and RGB lighting. It's also got a proprietary connector over here as well. We've got one of those on the MSI B860 Tomahawk, which is what we're going to be looking at in just a moment. The cooler, you can see my full review on the channel in the description up above, or in the banner up above, sorry, or the description down below, so don't forget to check that out. But really here I just wanted to show you what this case, the MSI Gungnir 300R Airflow, is capable of. So easily housing a 360mm radiator in the roof. In fact, there's room for something probably a little bit thicker as well, thanks to its offset mounting in the roof. And we have a rear fan and three 120mm RGB fans included as standard, and they look great when powered up. So obviously plenty of scope here for even larger graphics cards, and also custom liquid cooling if you wanted to do that in this case. So it's a very versatile case that's really great for air cooling or liquid cooling, and that is the case that we have decided to go for today. So we're just going to check out the motherboard and then we can start the build. Okay, so here is our motherboard of choice, and here is our processor of choice as well. So we have the Intel Core Ultra 5 245K, and as I mentioned earlier, what you might want to consider, depending on the pricing near you, is dipping down to the Core Ultra 235. Now that doesn't have overclocking support, whereas this processor does. But the reason why we're going for this processor today as opposed to a non-overclocking one, but even though we're using a B860 chipset, is because this one is a lot faster on the boost frequency and doesn't really cost that much more. So you'll still see the benefits of that even on a motherboard like we've got here. Now the other option you obviously have is to go for the Z890 version of this motherboard, which we just so happen to have here. So the Z890 Tomahawk Wi-Fi, again, it's worth looking at the pricing of this one, because very often the two boards are within like 20, 30, maybe $40 of each other, or the same in pounds here in the UK, and it's obviously potentially worth your while going for the Z890 model, especially if you're going for this bad boy here. So K-series CPUs, obviously overclockable, but what we don't want to do is to kind of end up with the wrong hardware. But so far, this one actually does run a fair bit faster. It's 200 megahertz faster on the peak boost frequency than the 235K, and there's not a lot of price difference between those two processors either. So it's going to be a mashup depending on where you are in the world and the pricing when you're watching this video as to whether you go for this or the 235 or the B860 or the Z890 version of the Tomahawk. So today we're kind of going with these two, which is a slightly strange mashup because we've got an overclockable processor with a non-overclockable motherboard, but it's just how the pricing lands really. It's there's no real point going, you know, saving maybe 10 or 20, 30 bucks on the processor when this thing runs it's 200 megahertz faster, and means that you can potentially do some overclocking in future. So now we're going to have a look at what we get on the motherboard. So I'm going to whip it out of its box, and you're looking at around $250 for this motherboard, maybe a little bit less. Pretty much the same here in the UK in terms of pounds. The Tomahawk offering up a tool-free M.2 SSD slot. So we've got PCI Express 5 support on this slot, but obviously we're only using a PCI Express 4 SSD in this situation. And what we have is a thermal pad here that transfers the heat from the SSD to the heatsink, so it should be keeping our SSD nice and cool and no need to worry about buying anything else. And I just love the tool-free heatsinks that they have on these things now. They just make it so much easier than dealing with the fiddly screws, which you will have to do if you mount your SSD down here. It can be worth actually using this slot for the PCI Express 4 SSD because it is a bit larger, but it depends on the thickness of your graphics card as to how easily you're going to be able to get at that heatsink down there as well. And obviously you have to deal with screws and stuff. So for our purposes today, we're going to be using the top slot. Now, looking around the side at the rear I/O panel, we've got plenty of Type A USB ports. So we've got 4 USB 2 ports there, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. So that's 10 gigabits per second. Very, very fast, much faster than USB 3 or USB 2 that we've got here. We also have a Thunderbolt port as well. So you may or may not have Thunderbolt devices, that kind of thing, but they can be useful, especially if you're expanding out with extra connectivity and all that kind of stuff. But we do have a standard 10 gigabit Type C port down here as well. So also get Wi-Fi 7, and we've got the audio selection there. I think it's Realtek 4000 series audio, or let me just double check on the box to see what we have in terms of specifications. So yeah, it doesn't actually list it on there, so I will double check later on, or actually just put a note on the screen as to what audio this board actually has. And then we have a 12-phase power system for the power delivery, and that's cooled by these pretty large heatsinks sitting on the MOSFETs at the top side here of the board. So plenty of cooling going on here. So even if you wanted to use a Core Ultra 9 processor in this motherboard, it would probably be absolutely fine. And obviously we have some extra slots down here if you want to run a discrete sound card to beef up that audio. And we have, I was just looking at the little chip down here, see if I can use my Mark 1 eyeball to identify. I think that's what it was. But anyway, so we have the easy release as well for MSI, and this basically has a push button to release and lock again for your graphics card. So the whole idea behind that is that you put your graphics card in the slot and you just let it releasing to lock, and then when you need to come to removing it is why you really need this button. You can't really get to the graphics card release lever because you've got this big heatsink here, another chipset or PCH in this case heatsink down here. So the button is just to release your graphics card, and you can see the locking lever here just moving out of the way, and that means to release your graphics card you just need to press that button once and then just press it again to lock in place. So that is pretty much it for the motherboard. We've got plenty of fan headers for our needs in this particular system. We've got Wi-Fi 7, and more importantly, we've got plenty of SSD expansion as well. So we've got a PCI Express 5 slot up here, but obviously backwards compatible with PCI Express 4 as well. So let's crack on with the build. So here we are in the EFI, and I just wanted to show you a few things that we can tweak in here to make sure the system is running optimally. The first one is to locate the memory option over here where the mouse is, and then just move that across using one of the arrows to XMP1, and that will make sure that our memory is running at the correct speed, in this case DDR5 6400. So that's the first thing that you'll want to do when you come into the EFI. And other things that we can change, we can double check some of the fan speeds. So here we can see all the options for our fan control. We've got the CPU fan speed listed. That's currently running at about 900 RPM, and you can tweak the fan curve if you want to. Obviously it goes up the higher the CPU temperature. Our fans for the case are actually connected to a system fan header 1. There's no readout here because we've actually got multiple fans connected to that header, and when you do that you don't get a readout, but it is responding to the settings that we've got here. So at the moment, in the grid down below, we're actually at around 60% or thereabouts duty cycle. So that's kind of where you want the fans on this case. They're nice and quiet at this speed, producing lots of airflow. You don't really need them going any faster than this. So I'm inclined to leave everything as it is for the system case fans. So we are now coming up to 6 minutes into a 10-minute run of Cinebench R24, and the temperatures have pretty much stabilized, so I feel a bit more happy about reporting on them. And we've got a peak temperature here of about 73-74 degrees C. It's not really gone above that for the last minute or two, so this is a worst case scenario really for your CPU. So you're going to see much lower temperatures in games. As we saw a minute ago, they were about 10 degrees or so lower than this. As I mentioned, this is using all of the cores on your processor, so it's kind of a worst case scenario. So clearly the CPU cooler that we've chosen is more than capable of handling the Core Ultra 5 245K. So here we are in Cyberpunk 2077, the benchmark, and we're running at 2560 by 1440 resolution here, and just putting the system through its paces. This is actually the third run that I've been through, so the temperatures and everything else should be well up to temperature now. So the CPU, we're running between 60 and 70 degrees, which is pretty good considering we've just got a single fan air cooler in there. The GPU sitting at a nice chilly 55 degrees C currently, and the frame rate nearly up to 100 frames per second there. That's average, so not too bad at all from an RTX 5070. CPU usage as well around 50%, so there's plenty of headroom there, and no sign of CPU bottlenecking. So here we are running at 1080p, so 1920 by 1080, and the frame rate has rocketed up to nearly 120 frames per second, and everything else is looking pretty cool. The GPU maybe a little bit cooler than it was before, CPU usage down a little bit as well, but the key thing is the frame rate, so we're pretty much up to and topping 120 now, up to 130, so a really good result from the RTX 5070. So hopefully you've all enjoyed our slightly unconventional system build today, and of course there are lots more hardware options out there for you to consider with this particular build. We've already spoken about the Core Ultra 5 235K and the fact that you might be able to save a little bit of money opting for that slightly slower processor compared to the Core Ultra 5 245K that we've gone for today in this build. Now, another option you might want to consider is stepping up to the Z890 version of the Tomahawk motherboard from MSI on Intel's LGA 1851. In a lot of instances, that doesn't cost much more either than the B860 version that we've gone here. And of course, you get overclocking support included, as well as a few other features as well. So definitely worth checking out the price on those two boards, because even if you're not overclocking, the Z890 board might actually still be a slightly better buy, given the very close proximity and price in a lot of markets out there. So other situations you might want to consider different options. The cooler, well, there isn't really very many better options other than the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Black that we've picked here. If you can find something cheaper that's still a Tower 120mm cooler, then that might be a better option. But really, you don't really want to step up in cooling, because this cooler is plenty quiet enough and offers more than enough cooling to cope with this processor, even flat out in fairly high-end workloads. So the case, obviously, we've gone for one of my favorite cases here, the MSI Gungnir 300R, but there's obviously loads of cases out there that you might want to save a bit of money. We've obviously got lots of expansion possibilities in this case, but if you want to dip down to something smaller and cheaper, then all the hardware that we've chosen today should fit. Just bear in mind that graphics card is pretty large. It's very, very quiet running and very cool running as well, due to that. But you might have an issue if you try and fit it into much, much smaller cases. So that's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed the build, and don't forget to let me know in the comments down below. Chucking me a like and a comment just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you found this video informative, useful, or just fun to follow along. And also, thanks to MSI for sponsoring today's video and sending over the graphics card and the motherboard for us to play around with this build. So that's it from me today. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back very, very soon.